I had, a lot of early experiences that made me feel that I was emotionally unable to be the kind of parent that I wanted to be.
Balloons, bazookas, boobies, bosoms, boulders, cans, hooters, knockers, melons, honkers, jugs, rack, tatas, tits, torpedoes, guns, bust, doorknobs, coconuts, and our favorite one, the girls. Welcome to the All About Breastfeeding show, where your host, Lori, highlights mothers just like yourself and goes beyond the surface questions and digs deep so they share not only their joys and happiness in their daily breastfeeding life, but also their pain and struggles and how they worked through them.
Episode number 174. Welcome to All About Breastfeeding, the place where the girls hang out. I am your host, Lori Jill Eisenstadt, IBCLC, which stands for International Board Certified Lactation Consultant, and I help moms with breastfeeding. Here I go, dating myself again. It's important, though, that I give you some perspective so that you can begin to understand exactly what today's guest means to me. Many moons ago, when I was a young mother, I was typically the one they call the weird one, the black sheep of the family and friends. We made a conscious decision to avoid eating animal products and focused on plant food. I took my recycled containers to the health food store in Port Jefferson, New York, Long Island. I purchased as many items as I could in bulk. Nobody was doing it then. I have such warm and fuzzy memories of the smell of the store. In my mind's eye, I can still see myself walking into the health food store with delight as I checked out these huge wooden barrel-shaped bins to see what was on sale that week. I would use these big scoopers and take portions of grains and put it into my containers and weigh them and price them before going to pay for them. Crazy as it sounds, but there was such joy in the feel of hundreds of little tiny brown rice grains being scooped up into that scooper. I loved the feel of it and the sound that it made. The little tiny grains of quinoa had an air of dust as I scooped this up. No one in my family had ever heard of quinoa before. Now it's a common grain. No one used to go to these big barrels and scoop up food in bulk. Now it's pretty common. No one I knew back then was buying in bulk, and now it is commonplace. At the counter, I packed all my purchases in paper bags that I had used before. No one I knew was crazy enough to reuse their paper bags. What for, they would say to me, that's ridiculous. Now, everyone is. Not only that, in some places, it's against the law to use plastic bags in the supermarket. When I got home, I poured all the different food items, the lentils and grains, into beautiful glass jars that I displayed nicely in the pantry. A few years later, when I had my first baby, she would come with me to what we called Carol's store in Massapequa, New York, on Long Island. Her store did have a name, but I don't even remember what it was because my first daughter dubbed it Carol's store, and that's what stuck with me. She basically grew up in that store and in the library around the corner. Every Tuesday and Friday, we would go to story time at the library, and then we would go to Carol's store. As she got older, she knew she could pick a treat at Carol's store. Well, let me rephrase that. Carol usually gave Alicia a special treat each time we came in. As I had my second and third baby, they all came to know Carol as she watched our family grow. Yes, we were the weird ones on the block who reused items we recycled whenever we could with whatever we used. And there were no recycle programs back then. I know, it's so hard to believe that now. In the middle of mainstream America, I was doing my best to live what was then an alternative lifestyle. We were always being made fun of. I retreated often to my special place when things got really bad. This helped to reinforce the way I wanted to live and raise my family, which was way different than the norm. I liked having my babies at home with a midwife in attendance. I loved having my husband catch the babies as they were born. It was my pleasure to breastfeed all my babies, keep them in bed with us until they no longer wanted to be there. When I was so desperate for sleep, I dabbled in the Ferber method, but very quickly I realized I could not bear to let my babies cry it out. It just didn't seem right, no matter how tired I was. And I retreated to my special place again for reinforcement that what I was feeling intuitively was right and that I should continue to follow my instincts. Potty training with my first? Well, it was just awful. I tried all the tricks and bribing with toys and special treats. Alicia seemed at times to get it, and then I swear I felt like she was out to get me. Just when I thought I could count on her to stay dry when we went out to the store, she peed in her pants, and that soaked her car seat. And I had not even gotten to the store yet. With a newborn in tow and a toddler crying from being wet, I again retreated to my special place. I needed more reinforcement to do what I felt was the right thing to do. It didn't matter that she was 2.5 and all her little friends were potty trained. I just stopped trying to push it and decided to let her tell me when she was ready. Mothering was so much better when I did my best, if at all possible, within reason, to follow my child's lead, rather than let society tell me how to parent. As the years went on, the decisions I had to make as their mother continued to add up. It would have been so much easier to follow the norm, to ignore what I was learning, to do what my family has always done. I just could not ignore what was in front of me, though. I believe at the time that what we had been doing was not working so great, and so I continued to find different ways to raise my family. I questioned vaccination and discipline and overuse of antibiotics. I questioned circumcision and learned about informed consent. I read about VBAC and water birth. I wanted to focus on building my kids' immune systems through breastfeeding and whole foods, with no sugars, soda, and candy. For the rare times when they were ill, I used herbs and homeopathic remedies. Because my children's pediatrician did not know about these substances, and quite the contrary, told me I was being a neglectful mother, I switched my family's care to osteopathic and naturopathic care. Slowly, gradually, time after time, incident after incident, I began to really learn to trust my instincts, to take a breather once in a while, to listen to that little voice inside, to think WWPD. And I evolved into the kind of mother that I was truly happy with. WWPD stands for What Would Peggy Do? And while I do not mean that literally, that Peggy's word was the law, her editorials in her magazine and the articles in her magazine always made me think big, think outside the box, and encouraged me to think for myself. Her magazine, Mothering Magazine, was my lifeline as a young mother. I lived in a world with no Google, no internet, no online forums. Mothering Magazine was read cover to cover many times over until a few months later when the next issue finally came out. It was so good and so chock full of information on pregnancy and birth and breastfeeding that was just so simple and uncomplicated that it spoke right to me and validated some of my most important mothering decisions. I even read the classified ads, which were like mini articles by themselves, as I learned about baby wraps and non-toxic wooden toys and alternatives in food and healthcare. Yes, Peggy and Mothering Magazine saved my sanity and taught me how to be confident in my mothering lifestyle. My special place was first and foremost, really, a quiet place, which that's what Peggy's editorials were called in each issue, a quiet place. It always felt like what she was writing about, that she was just sitting at my kitchen table having a conversation with me. My special place was Mothering Magazine, my lifeline in helping me trust in my own mothering. When Peggy said yes to being interviewed for the All About Breastfeeding show, you can now begin to understand why my heart went pitter-patter and I walked on air for days. You will hear me begin this interview by telling her personally how much she meant to me. Let's get started with my interview with Peggy O'Mara, who was the editor and publisher of my favorite magazine, Mothering. Peggy O'Mara is the editor and publisher of PeggyO'Mara.com. She founded Mothering.com in 1995 and was its editor-in-chief until 2012. Peggy was the editor and publisher of Mothering Magazine from 1980 to 2011. The author of Having a Baby Naturally, Natural Family Living, The Way Back Home, and A Quiet Place. Peggy has conducted workshops at Omega Institute, Esalen, La Leche League, and Bioneers. She is a mother of 4 and grandmother of 3. And on a personal note, I just want to say before Peggy comes on that I have been, I think we might say a girl crush since 1984. I first found your magazine in a health food store on Long Island. And for me, I was really alone in many things mothering. I was that anomaly of person who was recycling when I could. I brought my bags back to the health food store. I brought my containers back to the health food store to fill up. I was a vegetarian. I was cloth diapering. I wanted to learn all I could about midwifery. I had my babies at home. I learned about homeopathy from your magazine and the overuse of antibiotics and to question vaccinations and just so much more. So your magazine was like a lifeline to me because I had, in the very early years of my mothering, I had nobody who thought the same way that I did. So I was definitely one of those people who read your magazine from cover to cover. And funny enough, like literally even read all the advertisements in the back because they were also a window into learning about new things and baby wearing and products. And one of my favorite things was when you would do, I think it was at the year end, you would show another whole picture of all of your family and staff. And I would get to see year to year it grow and change. So it was definitely a lifeline. And I could probably speak for an hour about what your magazine meant to me.
Oh, thank you so much, Lori.
You are very welcome. So yes, I would love to welcome Peggy O'Mara to the All About Breastfeeding show. I'm thrilled that you said yes to being interviewed.
Oh, it took a little while. But I am so glad to be here. Thank you for asking me. And, as you talked about your connection to mothering, it just really moved me. And I think it's hard for people now with the internet maybe to realize, some of the young parents, how isolated many of us were in the 80s. We really didn't, we were really finding our tribe. We were really creating this whole kind of universe that now has become pretty much mainstream. Everyone's thinking about breastfeeding or checking out baby carriers and wanting to eat more naturally. And so we really, together, I think all of us launched and seeded into the culture something that is very important.
Exactly. Like, I can't really make that connection, but Mothering Magazine was my internet back then. Like, even people would say about midwifery, like, there was no midwives listed in my yellow book. I didn't find out about midwives on Long Island until I joined a mothering group, and I was facilitating groups, parenting mothering groups, talking about birth on Long Island. And we were put to the task of going to all the hospitals and interviewing them about their epidural rates, their episiotomy rates, their C-section rates. And it was in the process of doing that I met a La Leche League leader that said, hey, why don't you come to our meeting next month? We're having a midwife come speak. And that was when my first baby was about 9 or 10 months old. And I was so incredibly excited because my first baby, I wanted to have a midwife and a home birth, but I could not find one in I'm always dating myself when I tell people this, but especially the younger generation. But I literally got out the phone book and I called every hospital within an hour from me. And I started asking if they had midwives there. And I was just turned down left and right. So then my next thing, Peggy, was I then devised this questionnaire. And then I started asking for the maternity unit. And then I started to say, is there any doctor, male or female, who practices anything like, I would first ask if they know what a midwife is, and half the time I would say no. Then the other half I had to say, well, kind of how they practice. And then I would say, is there any doctor there, male or female, OB, that practice similar to like a midwife, that really helped women who didn't want to have medication, who let them walk around. Now, this is in the 80s, where we were tied to the bed so much more than they are even now. And after calling about 5 different hospitals, actually one that was like within a 20-minute radius for me said, yes. Oh, Dr. Rochelson. A lot of people don't like to be his nurse because they don't know what to do with his patients.
Well, how great that you were able to really persevere and ask those questions at that time. I mean, that's what you had to do. You had to, yeah.
Yes. And then after doing this questionnaire, there was one midwife who did births in the hospital that I knew of all in Long Island. But then I was looking for a home birth midwife. And then I had this really weird thing happen in my apartment complex. Do you know those little seats with wheels on it that we used to put babies in, and they were deemed unsafe after a while? Well, there was an apartment building next to mine, and I was walking Alicia in her stroller, and a woman came out of her apartment screaming. And so, I stopped and I came up to her and she said, my baby fell down the stairs and I don't know what to do. Well, her baby did fall down the stairs in one of those things. And I put her and her baby in the car and drove them to the closest hospital. And I sat with her in the waiting room. We got into a discussion. Her baby was born at home in that apartment. And I was like, here she is in the throes of not knowing what's happening with her baby, but I'm trying to keep her mind off of it. So I didn't really ask her until like 2 days later. I knocked on her door and I said, now tell me all about this. I can't believe there was a baby born in this apartment complex and you're at home. And so then a whole world opened up because once I found one midwife.
Well, and that's what I try to say to people even now. It's keep it simple. Find that community of normal birth. If you find the community of normal birth in your community, then you will be led to have the kind of birth that you want to have. And I think that's sometimes back in the day, like in the 80s, that's an amazing story of how this, the serendipity of finding a home birth midwife that way. But
yes.
Now it's a little bit easier. And I think, again, it's where, finding, like you said, tell me all about it. What's this community about?
Yes, exactly. I was like a sponge. So tell us a little bit about your upbringing. It's always interesting to learn a little bit about that, how you grew up, where you grew up, getting a little of that background info from my guests.
If I were on the other side of talking to me, or I think that people would assume that because I did mothering, I had this wonderful experience. And I think actually I did it because I didn't have a wonderful experience. My father was in the military, so I grew up moving around quite a lot. We were strict Catholics, so I had a pretty conservative upbringing in Catholicism and in the military. I loved moving around in terms of seeing different places, and I think it expanded me in ways I wouldn't have been otherwise. But it was very hard emotionally. My parents fought a lot and they drank a lot. And there was domestic violence. So I had, a lot of early experiences that made me feel that I was emotionally unable to be the kind of parent that I wanted to be. So I think for mothering for me was a way to shore myself up with information, research, all these things that people were doing. Like I was always somebody that was finding out stuff and sharing it with others, even before the internet, even before what they called networking. And I think that for me, that was the way that I helped myself emotionally to be the kind of parent that I wanted to be, because I didn't really have that model growing up.
And that's so interesting because I think more often than not, we hear more people talking about not knowing any different way. And so then on an unconscious level, just repeating
it's
that cycle.
It's hardwired in us, and it should be. The things that we learn when we're in those first 3 to 5 years are literally hardwired so that we'll do the right thing when we have to instinctively. And when we're hardwired to, violence or, just not the kind of, to getting our nervous system, I think, deregulated by parenting that isn't nurturing, we have to kind of undo that and lay down new neural pathways for ourselves, which fortunately can be done. But it is a process. And I think just kind of having that self-awareness to know that you want to learn more is really important. And I agree. I think that's a lot of us. I mean, we're not, and I actually think that most of the people, or a lot of the people who read a magazine like Mothering are looking for that. Because I think if you've got that in your family and you've got that down and figured out, then you probably have to read about it very much because you've got it kind of inside of you, On the other hand, there's all the changes that went through in our generation, all the new, really, which were old practices that came back and be resurrected. So learning about those things and just having community is essential for, I think it really is so essential for being the kind of, just have, the kind of parent you want to be.
Do you remember anything specific, or were you exposed to another role model who opened up your eyes to the kind of parent that you might look to be?
I think even though the nuns get all this bad rap, I really feel like the nuns for me was something that it was somebody who consistently encouraged my intellect and nurtured me in ways that I look back on and say, wow, there was this one in high school who noticed that I was a good writer. And so she put me on the high school newspaper and I started to think about journalism. And so I definitely think that the nuns really were nurturing for me. I was also a reader, and I remember reading a book called Summerhill, which is about basically a free school in England. And I read it in, I think, my first year in college. And it was the first time I'd ever read anything that said, wow, you could be a good person without having to use authoritarian methods, without having to control everything that you did. So that kind of cracked open my thinking, which is kind of what was more in tune with my instincts. And I had 2 great grandmothers. My grandmothers were fantastic. I had a lot of great aunts and uncles. So I did have some good models. So, a lot of different influences.
It's even interesting because when I think about my growing up, I had a pretty good childhood. I would say it was fairly average. But the thing is, my mother had 5 children and she gave birth in the hospital and she formula fed all of her 5 children. My oldest sister, who was the first in the family to have children, she had 2 cesareans. She formula fed. Everybody who I babysat for formula fed. So I'm actually so far removed from it that when someone did ask me the question years and years later, I cannot even remember anything specific. Like, if I grew up in that and everybody else around me was doing that, how on earth I decided that I wanted to look into midwifery and home birth? But there was one book that had like 2 sentences about it, and it talked about it in a very negative way. And I took it as like, ooh, wow, that is a possibility. There was still nothing on the shelves about midwifery in my library, but that gave me that little impetus. But the whole everything about, I guess we could have called it a movement, so to speak, about home birthing, midwifery, and breastfeeding and baby wearing and all that. I just kind of found my tribe, my people, and we kind of learned with each other. And we were having these groups on Long Island, these grassroots groups, inviting other women to learn about, this style of.
I think for me it was La Leche League because I was living in a southern New Mexico town, very rural, very back in time. And then I happened to see a notice about a La Leche League meeting when I was first pregnant. And so that was my first entree into everything. And it was perfect because La Leche was talking about this model for mothering. And I think that really influenced me more than anything, that, breastfeeding is a way that teaches you to be a mother by following those cues of your baby, by following that instinctual process. So for me, I think learning what I learned in La Leche League, and then that led me to home birth and midwives and all kinds of other things and all the questions that all the other moms there were asking. So for me, it was those meeting with those other moms, especially in La Leche, that helped me.
Yeah, La Leche League is wonderful. I actually attended my first La Leche League meeting about a month or so before my first baby was born. And I didn't necessarily get the style of mothering, but they were definitely an influence to breastfeeding. And to me, that was incredibly important, even more so than it might be for some moms now, because I didn't know anybody else who was breastfeeding.
Saw it around my hippie friends, I'd be staring at them like, what is that? And just like everybody does, what is that? I want to see it. I don't object to it. I just want to see it.
And, I did that classical first meeting where the leader had like a 2+-year-old child. I kind of had that thought, but at the same time, I was incredibly intrigued. And I really, at that very first meeting, here's what happened is that, one of the kids cried, they hit each other or hurt each other or something. And that 2+-year-old child came and climbed on its mom's lap for nursing. And what I really got out of it was, one thing like, oh, maybe the oddity of it all. But the other, I thought, wow, there's no more crying. It stopped. So I was incredibly intrigued from that point. But yeah. So tell me a little bit about with your first baby and breastfeeding.
My first baby, I have 4 children. Yeah, she's now in her 40s, which is unbelievable. Her name is Lally. It's somewhat similar to your story about looking through the phone book. I was living in southern New Mexico. I wanted a midwife. My husband worked with a woman who'd been a midwife in Britain. We had a couple of friends who were training to be midwives, but they lived a few hundred miles away. So I called up the state health department saying, where are the midwives? And they weren't certifying them then. So we were trying to kind of get rid of the traditional midwives and move towards the certified nurse midwives. And turned out later there was a movement to actually get both certified, which has been great in this state. But at the time, there was nobody. So I went to an obstetrician, and I just thought that somehow that those friends, those that were training to be midwives, were going to come over. So basically, I kind of started out with an unattended home birth in the beginning. I had a really long pushing stage. There were too many people there. I didn't really have any support in what I now know is kind of what a doula does to really stay with you. So ended up transporting to the hospital and fortunately not having a cesarean, but having my baby there in the hospital in southern Mexico. Breastfeeding went great. There was no trouble with that. We breastfed right away. She was a very easygoing baby, and I had a good experience breastfeeding her. I did get pregnant again right away and had another baby that was just 18 months after my first, and was nursing them both, trying to nurse them both, which was crazy, just crazy logistically. And that second nursing was a little bit more difficult because of that, just because my second child was more fussy. And then my third son was born with a birth defect, and I had cleft lip and palate, so I really still wanted to figure out how to breastfeed him, and that was my most challenging breastfeeding experience because I pumped and I fed him with a spoon, and then I made these little mixtures, and then he was not really able to successfully breastfeed too much, but he ate a little bit in the beginning. I had really different breastfeeding experiences. My fourth child, I nursed her till she was 6, and not because I even had that idea. It was just like then I didn't even care. When she weaned, I knew she would, and she was nursing like never. That would be like once every 6 months at that age. It wasn't like, it was just did have not yet, but all my babies did wean themselves because I thought that made total sense. That I didn't want to, I noticed that I would be ambivalent, as it was coming and ending the nursing experience. I came to realize that was part of the weaning process in itself, that I would also be kind of ready to be done. Just let them kind of find their own pace as best I could. And, it was sometimes challenging, but I felt good to do that. So, yeah.
So with your first baby, Lally was her name, did you notice a change in her breastfeeding when you were pregnant? Did you realize that you were, I guess the first question is, did you realize that when you became pregnant that you were at risk for losing?
No, because that was in the 70s. Who knew anything about that, right? I mean, So I did feel that my nipples were more sore, that my milk supply it seemed like it changed. I took a lot of extra B vitamins because I researched that and thought that would be helpful. But yeah, I think I didn't know that then.
But she's continued to breastfeed.
Yeah, she breastfed till she was 4, and so then she could barely talk. Right? I mean, she was just a little. She was not even 2. Like she was a little, maybe getting closer to 2 at this point. But then she says to my husband, "You take baby, Mama take Lally." In fact, they tease each other now, and my son Finney always says to Lally, "You stole my calcium," because his teeth are terrible. But mine are too. So.
Part of that is genetics, right? Definitely don't want to give anybody the impression because, there's all those breastfeeding myths and then some people decide not to breastfeed.
And you know that the breast milk sits in it's a bodily fluid, so it's the formula that's the problem. It sits in the mouth and pools and has sugar in it and causes tooth decay, but breast milk simply can't do that. My thing about the calcium was because they were tandem nursing, because they were both nursing. And I think, that's a whole nother thing. I mean, that's something that most people aren't going to do, and they're obviously going to need a little bit extra nutrition when they do it. But no, because breastfeeding definitely does not cause dental caries. In fact, I can tell when I go to the dentist now, they always tell me I have such a small mouth and I've had all this dental stuff and I wasn't breastfed. And so I know that breastfeeding develops the jaw, develops the mouth. It would, if anything, lead to a decrease in pretty much everything. But
the tandem nursing, I'm even trying to think back because one of my jokes that I often talk about on this show is that there are so many terms that are used now that I didn't necessarily know that there were terms for it. Like, I didn't really talk about bed sharing and co-sleeping. I just said I slept with...
Oh, I know the vocabulary. We have to do a glossary now. It's like...
Right, and I didn't talk about tandem nursing. You were just nursing both your kids at the same time and, baby wearing and attachment parenting lifestyle. Like, to me, attachment parenting was again another term. It was something that I did. So I'm curious, do you remember being aware of that term tandem nursing when you were doing it?
Yeah, because it was, I wonder if it was when I did hear it. I'm not sure. Because I was in La Leche League, I think I may have heard it early on. But I know there was a book about it that came out and had that term in it. So I think I may have heard it then. But overall, I don't like these terms because I think they make things seem like there's a prescription, right? Even the whole growth of the term attachment parenting, it makes it seem like it's a thing that you do. It's a prescription that you follow. And as you know, it's not. It's following your natural way as best you can, following things that are, more the way people have done things for millions of years, not some newfangled idea. I don't exactly remember when I heard tandem nursing. I think I heard it back then, but generally we've got a little bit of too many words for all these, trying to put all things into boxes in a way, like with this. They believe all these things. I don't think so. Especially breastfeeding. Everybody breastfeeds.
Exactly.
So that's everybody. There's all kinds of different beliefs and things and attitudes about everything.
I know. I feel the same way about some things, and sometimes I feel right now it is escaping me, but there are some terms that are used now that I'm like the golden hour and the sleep regression, the 4th month sleep regression and 3rd month. I'm like, what? Like my babies. I mean, there are lots of articles and everything about it, and I know that I'm going to freak some of the new moms out who do read about that and learn about that, and they can feel like that's a good topic and a label to understand and learn about. But for me, it was just like, when she's 3 months old now, she kind of changed her sleeping behavior again, and when she's 5 months old, they change their sleeping behavior. It's this constant evolution of constant change that I didn't have like a title or a label to put. It just happened.
And you want to be able to observe that, have some guidance, not get worried if things aren't following some formula. Because some babies are so different when they walk, when they talk. My little grandson, he's just a little over 2, and his mom was concerned because he wasn't talking. And I was hanging out with him, and I said, he's talking so much because he would talk with his eyes and his hands, and you could almost feel like the words were too huge for him to get out. Like it was just too much to say the word because he was already so moved by the experience. And we just joked and talked about it. And sure enough, he jumped into talking, floated into it soon after that. And so that's what I would just caution in terms of, looking for things to kind of quell your anxiety as a new parent, not to get too prescriptive about things and to watch your child and to really let your child be the guide. Your child is the one that will teach you how to be a parent. And I think that's reassuring it was to me because I felt, like I said, I didn't know what I was doing, but if I could follow my child's lead and trust my child, and my child's needs and wants were the same, that was the golden time or whatever that was the word.
Yeah, well, I think you're right, and you were able to express something in a way that I didn't, and that really is about my concern about having specific labels to stages and developmental phases that our babies go through, and that if they're not meeting that at the time, then we're thinking there's something wrong, and I'm not seeing too much leeway and wiggle room for maybe not a day or two later, but even a month or two later or 3 months later that your child might be walking or talking. And so it brings up lots of anxiety with mothers. And I just wish that they could be, some could be a little bit more looser about all these labels and terms. And like you said, just really watch your child and don't rush to such a quick judgment or let other people make you think. I think that's a big thing, is that more mothers I know that are actually in tune with their babies. I remember being that way too. I felt like I just didn't know so much and thinking other people were the experts. So when they said things, then I was like, oh, well, that must be wrong. That must be a problem, or that must be true, whatever it is they're saying, because I felt I didn't know. And what you learn after a while is to just trust your instincts and watch your baby and don't get too overly excited too quick.
Have your confidence undermined by others, either questions or questioning you, or so I think also keep some of those things private. Like if you're nursing a little bit longer than others, or doing things that you feel, just declare all what you're doing to everybody. If you're co-sleeping or bed sharing.
And we learned that after. I know it took me a little bit to learn that. I'm like, well, I didn't have to tell them that. Why am I?
You certainly don't need to tell your family, because they will have already figured it out before you even do it anyway, because they think you're crazy. And they'll be like, my mom would say, you're going to do that homeschooling thing, aren't you? 20 or 30 years later, she's in Walmart and she pulls this young woman aside and she says, you should do that homeschooling thing. So anyway, just keep it to yourself. I think things, it's okay to keep things to yourself.
Oh yeah, I learned that. But I have a little funny story about that too. When I had my second baby at home, and my parents literally got into like huge fights over it. My father was like, honey, you got to do something with Lori. She just cannot have that baby at home. This is dangerous. This is negligent. You got to talk to her. And then my mother would address me and she would say, I know you're probably not going to like this, but your father's driving me crazy. And, really talking about the home birth thing. And I'm like, I don't care. I'm still doing it anyway. And my father was just so against it because he was just so frightened of it. And my parents lived about a mile away from me when I had my baby at home. And my father, who owned his own business, who worked, 6 days a week, 14-hour days. Well, I gave birth to Jesse at 12:45 a.m. And he was at my house like 5 minutes later after he was born, seeing his new grandbaby. And my husband worked with him. And my brother-in-law made a huge sign to put in front of the store. And when my husband, who didn't stay home that long, but a couple of days, and when he went back to work, he said, you wouldn't believe your father. It's as if it was his idea to have the baby at home. And he is just telling all the customers about how you had that baby at home and how everything was good and you didn't have medication and how the grandmother was there. And he's just going on and on and on like it was his idea. And then the great thing is the next baby born at home, he didn't have no argument about anything. He just left us alone.
That's beautiful.
Taking a break to let you know that today's show is being brought to you by allaboutmothering.com, the new membership site where you can learn about the stages of mothering from even before you conceive your baby. The learning you receive on this site walks you through the 3 trimesters of pregnancy, offering some different points of view and topics that you might not typically be learning about. Subjects that take you through your birth, breastfeeding, postpartum, all the way to your baby's first birthday. For more details on how to join us, go to allaboutmothering.com. I also wanted to remind you about one of our contributors to All About Mothering, Elizabeth Joseph, who is a certified holistic nutrition specialist and living foods coach. I was so excited to learn of her next program, which is a sugar detox program meant to reboot your metabolism and immune system. She makes all the juices and foods you will be eating, so this particular program is for those local Phoenicians, however. I know she also helps many people online. For more information about Elizabeth and her programs, check out bemoreraw.com. That is BEMORERAW.com. Tell her you heard about her from Lori, the host of All About Breastfeeding show. A copy of her flyer is in today's show notes. Okay, so returning to the show where Peggy tells us how she was left to follow her instincts when it came to breastfeeding and feeding her third baby, who was a beautiful boy born with cleft lip and cleft palate. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your third baby, who was your son, was born with a cleft lip and palate, and it sounds like you pumped and spoon fed. Was there any help for you at that time to work with a baby with a cleft lip and palate?
That was some of the hardest times of my life, and there wasn't a lot of help, no. I mean, I did eventually find help, but everything's happening so fast, and I didn't know how to feed him in the beginning. So and he was born at home. I don't know how we even eventually found out about a service where they had a woman who was a feeding consultant. But then it turned out that she was kind of just actually watching me to make sure he didn't lose too much weight and then being ready to take him away from me if he did. Yeah, I mean, and I was like, wait a minute, wow. It was really going to this plastic surgeon we already had to start going to a plastic surgeon right away when he was little. And I was, so I was pumping, feeding him that with a spoon, making him these little mixtures. But I went to this plastic surgeon and I kept asking everybody, what about breastfeeding? What about breastfeeding? And I said, what did they do in Africa? I mean, what did they do in other countries? And he said, oh, the babies just died. But then this other doctor comes in and says, no, I worked in Africa. And they would spoon feed him, and he told me enough that I could kind of make up this little thing that I did. I found that if I could sit down on the floor, put my knees up, kind of straddle him on my knees and put his head to the side, because if I could somehow block the palate, a little bit with my breast, he could get a little bit more suction. So I was calling up people. So no, there was not very much help at all. And since then I have seen a few articles, but I was helped I was able to find people through La Leche that gave me some ideas. I did even go to a La Leche conference with him when he was little and, got some information there. Well, I was actually pretty much sharing my information at that point. But yeah, so no, there wasn't very much. I don't even know if there is now. I mean, I bet there's more, but again, when these things happen, you're not prepared for them. It's hard to find it fast enough,
Totally not prepared. And I often think, for me, I don't know how you think about this, Peggy, but for me as a new mother, I lament about how I didn't have the internet, but then there are parts of me that I think part of me is kind of glad I didn't have the internet as a young mother.
I don't know. I have mixed feelings because I was in such an isolated place. It sounds like you were in a more populated area, but because I was in this rural southern New Mexico and I felt really isolated as a mom, I think I would have liked it for that reason. But the distraction, maybe you're talking about just the distraction and the voices and the noise.
Yeah. The too much information and not knowing what was reliable or not. I already know how I was with live people, thinking that other people were the expert and I was new at this. So I think if I had the internet, how I would figure out, like a lot of things, technology is the good, bad, and the ugly. And I don't know. Overall, it doesn't matter because it's constant change and it's here to stay. But sometimes I do wonder about that. With all your years of your own personal experience and everything that you've learned from interviewing other people and all the articles that were printed in the Mothering magazine, is there one or two things that you would have to say to new mothers who are breastfeeding?
I think I've already said it in the sense that trusting your baby and letting your baby teach you how to be a mother. But breastfeeding is a fantastic mothering tool. I don't know what I would have done without it. So I think it's really allowing your baby to lead and following that lead and learning to be a mother that way. And then by trusting your baby, you start to trust yourself and then you start to trust others. And so it just kind of changes your whole relationship to everything. And the other message would be trusting yourself, because as a parent, like you said, that's the one message you get. All these voices, especially now with the internet, learning to trust yourself as a parent. I mean, that kind of means you have to learn this vocabulary of your intuition. Like, how do you get information? Do you get a stomach ache if somebody says something that's true or not true? Do you get the chills? Is there some kind of knowing? I mean, just like you're running into that woman and her baby falls down the stairs and you're going to find out about home birth from her. I mean, that's what happens really in life all the time, that we're given information, we're taken care of, So, yeah, so it's all about trust. Even now as an older person, it's like, I have this quote somewhere on my bookshelf, trust yourself and you will know how to live. So, because I think the only thing you can fall back on is when things are confusing is okay, I can trust myself. That kind of calms you, and then you can kind of review the information that you have about something.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. In this age of information, I think even more so than when we were young moms, I think it's harder for moms to even trust themselves. But so often I say to them, just sit quietly with your baby in your lap. Just sit quietly for 2 or 3 days with just your baby and nothing else, and start to learn how to read your baby. What is your baby trying to tell you? What are you feeling when your baby acts a certain way? What are you thinking? And I often tell them that they just need actually quiet, silent space without the rest of the world, so that they can try and get the beginning of learning about their baby. And once they get that, and I just love it when moms move from asking me, how do I burp my baby, to, I see them the next time and they're showing me different things that works with their baby. I'm like, yes, this is great. Even when they ask me how to burp their baby, I'm like, I don't know. I said, what have you tried? What seems to have
Yeah,
worked?
that's great. I have a quote I like too that is about go to nature and be very quiet. And it's that same thing. If you can just, and that's what's hard to do when you have a baby. Like now I can sit up on my bed before I go to bed and let the things settle in and, get some sense of perspective. I think that's a challenge for a new mom with a new baby. Maybe use that time when, like you're saying, when you're breastfeeding. So when you're breastfeeding, surrender into that and use that as a meditation for you about kind of to gain perspective that you need on your own life or any problems that you're facing.
Yeah, perfect. Go to nature and be quiet. This is a great place to take a natural break and complete part 1 of my interview with Peggy O'Mara. I might ask all of you busy moms, try and see if you can take 5 minutes each night. Just hold your baby in the quietness. No TV or music or electronic devices. Just cuddle with your baby and be quiet. What do you hear? What are you feeling? How good does it feel to just hold your baby without the rest of the world and all the noise and busyness surrounding you? Probably a very nice, peaceful feeling. All right, look out for another educational show on Friday, and then on Monday, we will have the second part of this interview. Until then, bye-bye.